Very nice. I also want to thank Joan Baum for the great article she wrote about my talk here. My wife this morning said it was so good that I should just read Joan's article. I don't have to give it. So if you want a synopsis of my talk, just go to last week's Southampton Press. Thank you, Joan. So you guys know I'm Tom Edmonds already, and the Southampton Historical Museum funds this talk and our preservation efforts. The Southampton Historical Museum, most of you know, manages 4 separate properties with 12 historic buildings. So we really do a lot to preserve Southampton the way it looked in the past. So remember that when I asked for money in May for the school levy. So my talk today is Pyrrhus Concer and Captain George White, 2 friends who transformed Southampton. There's not a lot of primary sources or documentation for these 2 men. There's some facts, there's some deeds, there's oral histories. What, turn it down?
Can I sound a little bit? Yes.
I'm fine.
You're fine? Okay, well, that's fine.
So there's not a lot of stuff, but there are a lot of narratives and interpretations from people who knew the 2 men, from people who knew about the men who were born after these 2 men had died. So I had to weave a story together about these 2 men's lives on other narratives and other people's interpretations. So the facts deserve, I think, deep research and get the real story out. So I guess that's a way of saying what I'm going to tell you is mostly true, but maybe not. Keep that in mind. Were they friends? Who knows? We don't have letters. They may have written letters, but they didn't save them, nor did they turn them into the Southampton Historical Museum like everybody should here. Don't forget us. But we do know a little bit about where they were born. So if you look at the blue spot, that's the Captain George White's house at the corner of Jagger Lane and North Main Street. And the red spots are where Pyrrhus Concer lived. George White was born and died in the same house at that corner, but Pyrrhus Concer only moved a couple times in his life, and all within Southampton. So if you see, number 1, Pyrrhus Concer was born what many people say is a slave. He was actually born an indentured servant, which there's not that much difference. That was not a good way to be born. And he was owned by Nathan Cooper, who may have been a ship's captain. Pyrrhus Concer was an indentured servant to him. Nathan Cooper sold Pyrrhus Concer to Charles Pelletreau. And if you look at red dot number 2, that's where the Pelletreau property was in the 18 teens. And then he died, Pyrrhus Concer died on Pond Lane right across from Lake Agawam. So they were close. I mean, they grew up in the same neighborhood. Whaling is essential to the history of Southampton. There's no way I can talk about the history of Southampton without talking about whaling. Whaling in Southampton begins 10,000 years ago. Paleo-Indians came either across the Bering Strait in Alaska, or they came across by boat from Europe. There's new theories out now that the first natives here came by boat from Europe. This is a great rock carving from the Inuit Indians around the Arctic. And this drawing, this image is 6,000 years old. Look at the boats. The boats have dragon heads or horse heads or something like that on them. They're big boats. Inuit Indians were doing offshore whaling long before Southampton or New Bedford or any place in Europe. They were going out, and you can see the lines. They had harpoons. They had lines going out to a whale, and you can see the baby next to the mother whale up there on the upper right. I think this is great documentation. The Shinnecock tribe developed around 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, and they did offshore whaling. This is a great painting by David Bunn Martin, who's the director of the Shinnecock Museum on the reservation. Here's another painting by David, which shows a Shinnecock whaling ceremony. David has done much research on both Western culture and Native American culture, and he's a genius at creating these images that really take you back. People, doctors, professors of history could talk about native life, something that we don't actually experience or have any visual record of. David is able to capture that with paint, and I think he's amazing. Beached whales were vital to the settlement of Southampton. In the town records, in 1644, it's recorded that the English pioneers and the Shinnecock together harvested a beach whale. So that was like manna from heaven. In 1650, John Ogden arrived here a couple of years before that, but John Ogden receives a patent from the Southampton magistrates for offshore whaling in Southampton. He develops the port of Feversham in North Sea. Some of you may know about Feversham. I've been talking about it for a couple of years now, but that's other undocumented, undiscovered history that needs to be uncovered, the history of Feversham. John Ogden's whaling company is the first in the Americas. Feversham becomes the third largest shipping port in North America. Now, for a small little village in North Sea with not very deep waters, that's quite a statement. So that tells you how important Feversham was to the development of Southampton. Captain George White descends from a long line of English fishermen dating back to the 1500s. And maybe even back. That's as far as I could research his genealogy, and it probably goes back farther. George White's house is at the corner of Main Street and Jagger Lane. Most of you, does everybody know where this is? It's across the street from the Methodist Church, just east of what used to be Waldbaum's. What's that called now? Keys?
Stop and Shop.
I'll never get that right. It'll take me. I used to call it IGA because everybody 10 years ago called it IGA when it was actually Waldbaum's. It's going to take me 10 years to. AMP, all right, I did it right. So George White was born in the back part of the house. The back part of the White House, if you look closely, is a very generic farmhouse. Very, very, not humble, but just a very, very plain farmhouse that we think was built in the 1750s. George White added on the front part of the house later, in the 1850s, we think. Pyrrhus Concer was born in 1814 to Violet Williams, a slave owned by Nathan Cooper. And I think Nathan Cooper, I think we're all sitting on Nathan Cooper's land right now. He also may have been a whaling captain, like I said. Nathan Cooper was a successful Southampton merchant and father of the whaling captain Mercator Cooper. I found yesterday in our archive, I found Nathan Cooper's Book of Sales, and this is an amazing document. It's been labeled, it was cataloged, but it has never been paid attention to, I think, until I just was digging through yesterday. And in it are accounts with local people, and he's selling bricks, fish, beef, and dung, a lot of dung, which is, of course, used for fertilizer, and it contains records, and he's supplying trade goods to Sag Harbor. So he's a merchant. He may have been a sea captain, but he's got connections in Sag Harbor, and he's selling goods to go out to sea. Here's an account of George White. This is Captain George White's father. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the date 1801. And also in this account book are the Pelletros, the Herricks, the Rogers, the Howes, and many more. Someday, and this book is not chronological by date. It's not alphabetical by name. It's kind of scattershot. He probably had his own method of accounting, like most people do. Someday I will go through here and maybe find the sale of Pyrrhus Concer. He also leased day laborers to local farmers. So Nathan Cooper made money by leasing out his indentured servants or anybody he could find for 5 shillings per day. Pyrrhus Concer's father was Shadrach Concer, a slave owned by Cephas Jagger, who lived in Westport. There's no marriage records have been found between Violet and Shadrach. How did they get together? Shadrach may have taken the 20-mile journey from West Hampton to Southampton to pick up supplies from Nathan Cooper and became friendly with Violet Williams. Now, That's my conjecture. Here's Concer's father, 20 miles away. His mother is in Southampton. Nathan Cooper is a merchant in trade. It's just a way of creating a story, maybe putting these two together. Is it right? Who knows? Pyrrhus Concer was sold as an indentured servant for $25 to Charles Pelletreau when he was 5. And here's an image of the Pelletreau house and the trade shop that's right next door to it. The Pelletreau house is gone, but it lives today as the Pelletreau Silver Shop, which is one of the properties we manage. Here's a collar for an indentured servant. We have one in our collection at the museum. Slavery in New York State. In 1664, slavery is legalized. 1799, the Gradual Emancipation Act is passed, where children born of slaves become indentured servants. They're still sold as property. They're still treated as property. There's not that much difference. In 1827, all slaves are freed. Males of slaves born after 1799 are indentured until they are age 28. I've seen it also listed as age 21. I think females were listed at age of 24. Indentured servants could be leased out with the income going to the owner. That sounds like slavery to me. Pyrrhus was leased out by Charles Pelletreau as a field hand. Pyrrhus was also sent out on whaling voyages. So Charles Pelletreau also sold him as a laborer on whaling ships. Life was tough at sea. Sailors who misbehaved received quick discipline. Voyages at sea could take up to 2 years or more before returning home. It was a tough life. In 1835, Pyrrhus Concer was freed at the age of 21 and became a sailor on a whaling expedition. Whaling Captain Mercator Cooper, son of Nathan Cooper, is a central figure to both of these boys who become men. He really was a person of influence for both these guys. In 1812, Captain George and Ruth White, George White's parents, purchased the Jagger House at the corner of Main Street and Jagger Road. In 1832, George White becomes a cabin boy for Mercator Cooper at the age of 13. Now, that's not George White in that illustration, but thanks to the internet, I can find illustrations that depict the narrative I'm trying to give now. A sailor's life was hard work, mixed with long hours of downtime. Pyrrhus and George sailed out of Sag Harbor and often shipped out on the same boat. The whaling industry was vital to Southampton's growing economy in the 1800s. Southampton was a very small agrarian village. It took 3 days by ox cart to get to New York City or Brooklyn. But by the time of the mid-1800s, railroads were coming in. The railroad went from Brooklyn to Sag Harbor, bypassing Southampton in the 1830s, because the whaling industry was creating so much trade and people were thriving. 50% of Southampton residents, half of the residents in Southampton, were in whaling. That doesn't mean they were all in sailors, but they might have been barrel makers. They might have been processing food. They might have been drying fish to go into barrels. Mercator Cooper's house was visible from the White's family house. So I think you all recognize that building right there. That's an image probably from 1900. You can still see some outbuildings off to the left there that are now the parking lot. A sailor's life on a whaling boat was both frightening and glorious. George and Pyrrhus grew up fast. Hardtack, made of dried flour and water and hard as a rock, was softened by eating it after it was fried in fat or dipping it in coffee. That's an actual object that we have in our collection. Isn't that great? And it's like a piece of brick. George and Pyrrhus both became boat steerers. And if you look at the bottom portion, you see a man holding an oar. He's looking back at his crew. Right in the center there, there's that guy right there is the boat steer. That would have to be the craziest job to have.
Oh.
I think if I was working on a whaling ship, I'd want to be the cook. I'd rather be in a secure galley. A boat steerer pulled the forward oar of on a boat until reaching the striking distance of a whale. He then harpooned the whale while a boat handler guided the boat. A boat steerer could also miscalculate and put his men in grave danger. God, that's scary. George spent the next 30 years rising from a cabin boy to a boat steerer, to a mate, and finally as a captain on a series of whaling ships. George advanced, but Pyrrhus did pretty good at becoming a boat steerer. I mean, if you think of the men, the crew on a boat, who is more important than the captain? I would have to say the boat steerer. In 1845, Mercator Cooper is the captain of the ship Manhattan, the first boat to enter Japan. It became an international sensation. Pyrrhus Concer is the boat steerer. And what's great about this drawing is it was done by Japanese of the actual ship Manhattan. It was a very important event for the Japanese as much as it was for the men who were on the boat. It'd be like seeing a UFO today, wouldn't it? The boat is met by Japanese warriors, and the boat was actually steered into Edo, which is now called Tokyo, and they were astonished to see Pyrrhus, the first black man they had ever seen. This is the only photograph we have of Pyrrhus. It's actually Pyrrhus taking probably when he's in his 70s on his catboat when he used to run a ferry on Lake Agawam. But this is our only image of Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus entertains the Japanese by singing songs, both sad songs and funny songs, and letting them touch his black skin. The Japanese tried to rub off the black of his skin. Pyrrhus later in life used to talk about how the Japanese were so surprised by him. They came up and tried to rub the color off of his skin, and they were amazed by the contrast of his very white teeth. In 1847, Pyrrhus Concer returns from Japan and marries Rachel Williams. Don't forget his mother's name was Violet Williams. Were they family? Were they cousins? Not sure. They move on to the property owned by Rachel's family on Pond Lane. So the Williams family were black, and they had, for I don't know how many years, they had property on Pond Lane. The couple had 2 sons who died young. By the mid-1840s, the whaling industry and Sag Harbor are thriving. This is the peak of the money and the trade, and everybody's getting rich. Well, the sea captains and the merchants are getting rich. This is a great illustration. It's a woodcut of Sag Harbor in 1845. What is whaling oil? How do you use it? Here's 2 great images of sperm oil being used as a lubricant. The Industrial Revolution, which started in America about 1820, was booming. Machines were becoming more and more popular. Sewing machines were new. They needed lubrication. Penumbra lamps. These are beautiful things, and they still are fueled by whale oil. They're fashionable, and they're almost in every single parlor. You had, at least, if you could afford it, you would have one and put it in your prime spot in your house, your best parlor, so that everybody could see it when they came in. Penumbra means without shadow. They're often called astral lamps as well. Astral is Latin for star. So that's why if they were in the center of the room, they wouldn't cast a shadow, supposedly. What else? Whale oil is a product in soap, in corsets, and umbrellas. How can you tell a sea captain's house on the South Fork? It's the Belvedere, what's on top there. That is the clue. The Belvedere, or sometimes people call it Widow's Walk, was an architectural fashion of the 1840s and 50s. I grew up actually in a house with a Belvedere that was made in 1853, but that's too late. That's too late for the South Fork because the whaling industry declined. So anytime you see a house that has a Belvedere on top, you know it was built in the 1840s. And so on the left hand we can see Mercator Cooper's house. In the middle is the Rogers Mansion, where I work. And on the right hand side is whaling captains, and I've seen two names. Whaling Captain Parker and Captain Howell, or both. Maybe they both lived there at different times. But it's now on Main Street, on North Main. I think you'll recognize it. It has shingles on it now, wooden shingles. It's between it's near Bowden Square. You'll see it next time you drive down North Main Street. It'll pop out at you. It has natural colored shingles instead of paint. Oops. Wow. Help. How do I go back? Oh, I know. This button. Okay. So everybody's rich. Everybody gives money to the church. On the left is the old Whaling Church in Sag Harbor, which was built in 1844. That's with its original steeple. The steeple was hit by lightning, I think, in the 1930s. Does anybody know?
Yeah.
Hurricane of 38. Thank you. I need fact checkers. Thank you. And on the right is the First Presbyterian Church in Southampton, painted in 3 different colors. It was whitewashed in about 1900, part of the colonial revival movement, when everybody thought churches and houses should be white. But have you seen there's a church in Amagansett, I think, that's different colors of blue?
It's a Presbyterian church also.
Is that the Presbyterian church? So the one in Amagansett was historically accurate to its origins. The Presbyterian church was 3 different shades of what color we don't know. Could have been gray, could have been brown, it could have been blues. The decline of whaling begins in November of 1845, and this is the whaling industry declines on the South Fork. It continues to go in other places like Europe and Japan, but in 1845 a fire in Sag Harbor burns 50 buildings to the ground. By the late 1840s, whales have become scarce. Ships were spending as much as 3 years out at sea. Imagine not seeing your husband, your brother, your son for 3 years. Mail is spotty, and you would have no idea if you had a loved one coming back to you. This is a drawing by J. Madison Topping of the ship Trident in the museum's collection. And I think this is about 1870s is when this was made. But on this drawing are its latitude and longitude. And where is that? Way up there. Way up there by the Arctic Circle. That's how far you would have to go for whales. Here's a close-up of the men capturing a whale with icebergs in the background. Now this is great documentation. I think these kind of objects, this simple drawing, tells us so much. It tells us about local men going to the Arctic Circle to do whaling. And imagine that they didn't have polar tech. This is a serious occurrence here in Southampton. 1849, gold is discovered in California. How did it affect Southampton? All of its available men who were sailors or weren't grounded by a trade or farming left for California. Lots of men went to California to become rich. This is a great photograph of San Francisco in 1849. In 1850, in Southampton, Captain George White, Pyrrhus Concer, and 11 other whaling captains got on the same boat. They invested $500 to take them to California. Imagine being on that boat with 12 captains. Who's in charge? They try their luck at panning for gold. George strikes gold and brings home a small fortune. Pyrrhus returns to Southampton broke. That's a great ad, isn't it? Finally, in the 1850s, coal oil, or kerosene, was mass-produced and was, of course, much cheaper than whale oil. In 1852, when George returns, he marries his neighbor girl that he grew up with, Elizabeth Fordham. Their granddaughter wrote, and this is, again, a nice diary and a nice documentation that tells the story of these 2 men. It's in our archive. The granddaughter wrote, "He must have had some success as a 49er because I wear my grandmother's heavy wedding ring fashioned from a gold nugget he brought back with him from the gold mines." That in itself is a nugget, I think, of history. George buys his parents' house, which is in the back, it's on the left-hand side, from his brothers and sisters, then builds a modest addition to the front. So you can see this, the 1850 portion is on the right-hand side, and it's much grander than the house in the back, but not as grand as some of the other mansions in Southampton. So I think George is a very prudent man. George and Elizabeth are actually in the front yard. George, there's photographs of George, and he has that same stand. It's probably stood like that all his life, with his hands in his pocket, and he looks stern. And I don't know what kind of portrait this is, a family portrait, or maybe it was a celebration. Everybody looks kind of grim and despairing, don't they? They're not gathered together like you think they would, but whatever. Somebody mentioned the stock market. Shipwrecks increase with new immigration and trade goods going to New York City. George White finds a new calling, and I'm sorry, this is a great photograph we have in our collection, but with no information. So we assume it was in Southampton because it's in our collection. The matting decoration tells us it's 1880, in the 1880s, but this is another good reason to mark the back of your photographs so that the next generation knows who they are. Sorry, I had to get that plug in. In 1847, the Ashland, carrying 300 Irish immigrants and crew, is grounded on Southampton Beach during a raging storm. Southampton villagers tried to row out to the troubled ship 3 times to save the passengers, but they failed. The storm is still raging. George White decides to join the crew. He leads the rescuers to the sinking ship, and all are saved. In 1874, the Alexander Laval is grounded at Southampton. George White is responsible for saving the crew of 30 men. What a guy. A quote by George White, and this floors me: "I can't understand why any man should be afraid of a maddened whale in mid-ocean or be afraid to launch a lifeboat during a raging surf." Well, I'm one of those men. I would never do it. That's nuts. What a guy. By 1870, Southampton had become a depressed village with the death of the whaling industry and farmers immigrating to the west for new land. That's a great photo. That is where CVS is now standing. You can see the geese going up and down the street here. Main Street was called Goose Run. And why are there geese? There are geese and pigs on Main Street collecting garbage. There were a lot of farmhouses like this lining Main Street, where what is now the business district. It was all farmhouses. You put a picket fence along the border to keep out the pigs and the geese. You would take out your garbage during the day and throw the slop in the middle of Main Street, and the geese and the pigs would eat it. Now we have a sewage problem here. I wonder if I should mention that to Mark Epley. In 1870, Dr. Gilliard Thomas, a gynecologist to wealthy society women in New York City, discovers Southampton and builds the first house on the ocean. He specializes in abortions and female hysteria. This is the first mansion in Southampton. It was called the Birdcage by locals. He brings his wealthy clients out to summer to relax and restore their health. You can see the wraparound veranda. I mean, that's just made for patients. He wasn't coming out here to relax. He was coming here to develop his clientele. His clients return and they build their own mansions, or as they're called, cottages. The village begins to prosper with new construction and by supplying services to what we call the summer colony. In 1871, passenger rail services extended to Southampton, making it easier for the Similak colony to transport their families. Life in Southampton quickly changes. This reminds me of a story about why Elm Street was developed. It was the Duke family had a big complex on the ocean called the Box. Maybe some of you, there were some people that used to work for the Duke family. Anybody here that are my age? The Dukes would land with their baggage, their servants, their children. It was a huge production. They would land at the depot station and then have to hire wagons and take them down Main Street to their complex on the ocean. They got tired of being shown all their earthly goods and all the people that were keeping apart, so they developed Elm Street. The Duke family paid for Elm Street to be developed so they could bypass Main Street. The summer colony enjoys spending leisure time in the ocean. Can you imagine what Southampton residents thought about this? This is the commercial hotel, which is now where the school Our Lady of the Hamptons is. But new hotels started springing up all over the place. Cottages are springing up on former farmlands. This is the Williston House, built in 1899 on ox pasture. The guy, Mr. Williston, liked to entertain during the summer, and he liked to portray himself as sort of a gentleman farmer. He used to rent sheep to be put in his pasture land. He'd go out to the back porch, show people the pastoral landscaping, and then send the sheep home at the end of the summer. Women thrive in Southampton. Away from their working husbands and the strict social conventions of New York City, women form cultural groups and create sporting events. This is a photograph of an en plein air artist group that's led by William Merritt Chase. These are very wealthy women who are going out, and these are the Vanderbilts, the Belmonts, a lot of big name people funded the development of the Art Village. They formed the first women's golf tournament in the U.S. This is a photograph from 1900 of competitors at Shinnecock Hill. Aren't those hats great? And then they're playing golf. This is a golfing uniform, not to mention. Think of the pins. Ouch. The Meadow Club was formed by two women who met for tea in a pasture which was located between their two cottages. They built the club so that they and their children could play tennis. George White sees an opportunity, and he creates the Southampton Coal and Produce Company, which supplies fuel and vegetables to the summer residents. And that's something we have in our archive, luckily. That's their letterhead. Pyrrhus Concer starts a business ferrying tourists across Lake Agawam near his home on Pond Lane. The red arrow points out to the catboat. That's probably the second image we have of Pyrrhus Concer. Windmills that once ground flour turned into summer retreats. By the 1880s, New York City developers arrived, attracted to Southampton's wealth of natural resources. They purchased the right to harvest oysters in Mecox Bay and create plans to build a canning factory. Now, they didn't build this, but this is an example of what Mecox Bay could have looked like. The rights were sold by the Southampton town trustees or proprietors. At the same time, others are proposing to build a racetrack and gambling casinos along the ocean. Hotels and private residences located on the ocean claim the beaches are private property. And here's the Clifton Hotel in Hampton Bays, which is now gone. The last straw came when the commercial harvesting of oysters began, and which, of course, would take away the livelihood of baymen, including Shinnecock, to become known as, and this became known as the Mecox Bay Scandal. That's an actual photograph of the beginnings of the oyster canning industry. Unfortunately, they angered George White, who was ready for a fight. That's such a great picture of George. Enraged by the corruption of Southampton Town Hall for letting this happen, George steers the election of new trustees who turn around and elect him president. George White begins a 20-year lawsuit to secure public access. Unfortunately, George White doesn't live to see the positive results. Near the end of their lives, George and Pyrrhus Concer were honored during Southampton's 250th anniversary in 1890. They are the only two men standing. Can you see that? It's kind of faded. There's two whaling boats. Here are whaling captains in here, kind of vague, and here's George, and here's Pyrrhus. I looked at this photograph for years. I guess this is the third photograph of Pyrrhus, and I always assumed he was playing the trombone. Here's George. He's age 71. He's right in the center of the picture. Fearless George White. And here's Pyrrhus. It's not a trombone. It's a harpoon gun. and he's 76. We have a harpoon gun in our collection. I'm not sure if it's that one or not. But we do also have a whaling boat. In 1890, the New York Times noted that there were 18 whaling captains alive and living on Southampton. Those red dots on the right-hand side show where they were actually living. Captain Albert Rogers' mansion is now the property of my museum. I should say our museum. Mercator Cooper's house today is the offices for the Rogers Memorial Library, where Penny works. George White died in 1893. Dr. Gilliard Thomas, the founder of the summer colony, wrote his obituary for the New York Times. He says, "Had he not intervened just when he did, no one can say what the state of our beautiful village would have been today." Which is so true. George fought for the preservation of Southampton's beaches as common public property to preserve the livelihood for local fishermen. And I think this is forgotten information. Farmers used the beaches for transporting vegetables between the villages. If you can think of dirt roads after a storm, you'd have to slog through the mud, so sand was a safer means of transportation. Pyrrhus Concer had many powerful friends that lived near him. You can see Pyrrhus Concer lives at the head of Lake Agawam. Salem, Wales is his neighbor next door. Elihu Root lives next to Salem, Wales. And down at the bottom, Dr. Thomas lives in his birdcage. Here's a closer look. Up on the upper right, can you see P. Concer? The small square in the upper right. And you can see the Wales estate, which has access to Pond Lane and First Neck. And then down at the lower left is Elihu Root's. Salem, Wales was a great guy. And he's forgotten. Most people don't think of Salem, Wales as one of the founders of Southampton Summer Colony, but he builds a house called Ox Pasture, 24-acre estate, which is now destroyed. He's the director of the National Bank of New England. His granddaughter, Ruth Wales, marries Henry Francis DuPont. Henry Francis DuPont was instrumental in saving Halsey House and restoring it, and also the Pelletreau Silver Shop. He did this in the 1950s and 60s when he was a summer colony resident. So Henry Francis DuPont will be the subject of another talk. He also founded the Southampton Bank. That building on the bottom in the photograph was just north of the Village Hall. He was president of the Southampton Improvement Society. He was New York City Parks Commissioner, and he also ran for mayor of New York City. Very powerful man. His neighbor, Elihu Root, built Mayfair on Pond Lane in 1896. It's known as Betty Sherrill's house today, and it's still standing. He married Clara Wales, daughter of Salem, Wales. He was U.S. Secretary of War in 1899 under President Garfield. He becomes U.S. Secretary of State later, which was just a change of title. Secretary of War was eliminated, and they gave it a nicer, more positive spin, I guess you could say. He was also a U.S. Senator from New York. He was president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1912. He also paid for Pyrrhus Concer's tombstone. Now, they were friends, or neighbors. They had contact with each other. Here's Pyrrhus Concer's tombstone. He died in 1897. His tombstone is located in the southwest corner of the North End burial ground, probably one of the very few African Americans who were buried there. And the inscription reads on the top, you can see on the face of it, you can see the dates, but on top right there, you can't see it, it's too faded. But this was, again, paid for by Elihu Root, and may have been written by him. Though born a slave, he possessed those virtues without which kings are but slaves. A memorial to Pyrrhus was quickly installed before the arrival of a delegation from Japan. The Japanese government had just installed a monument in Tokyo to mark the occasion of the ship Manhattan and Pyrrhus Concer coming to Japan. They were so proud of their memorial that they wanted to rush over to Southampton to see what we had done. The local government scrambles. Somebody finds an acre that was pulled. This anchor was pulled up out of Lake Agawam. There's no documentation, but there's no time either to like research it. They bronze the anchor and they create this nice plaque. Has anybody seen this?
Yeah.
It's right to it's west. You know where the monument is? The monument, the war monument.
Yeah.
It's directly west of that. It's right. It's by where the ducks are. Pyrrhus Concer's house was right across the street, and it was destroyed in 2014. A lot of it had been added on to after Pyrrhus Concer's death, so Pyrrhus Concer didn't walk into a house like this. But after it was destroyed, the town of Southampton purchased the empty lot in last year. The Sea Scout ship 908, when talk of Pyrrhus Concer started coming out, we celebrated Pyrrhus Concer's 200th birthday in 2014, and we had an event at the Southampton Historical Museum. But the Sea Scout ship 908 was inspired to reclaim an abandoned electric boat and turned it into a ferry, and they call it the Pyrrhus Concer. Their mission is to educate passengers about Pyrrhus and ensure that his legacy is not forgotten. You get a little spiel when you go on this 15-minute ferry. Has anybody been on the ferry?
Yeah, it's great.
Oh my God, it's amazing. There's Josh Bellery was instrumental in the project. Josh, stand up. It's such a great project. He's the leader of Sea Ship Scout. I won't say that. He's the leader. So it's beautiful. It's the most tranquil and relaxed I've ever been in Southampton. And you get to see the other side of the privet hedges. You get to see all the mansions that are hidden on the street. Last year, the village created a historic marker to mark the spot where his house was. And this is what a conception of what the house originally looked like when Pyrrhus lived there. The village of Southampton is committed to restoring the house. We have the original wood frame house at the Rogers Mansion, which is behind the Red Barn. So we've got the pieces, and Mark Epley is committed to building the wood frame house back to the way it looked when Pyrrhus lived there. Pyrrhus Concer also left $3,000 to the First Presbyterian Church to be used for the education of school children. It's still being used today. Dr. Thomas gave George's wife, or widow, Elizabeth, a beautiful photo album on the death of her husband, and we have that photo album at the museum. This is what the George White's house looks like right now. It's been under restoration for most of the year, maybe 6 months, and the museum owned the building. The house was given to the museum by Madeline White when she died in 2008, 2007. So the museum has been managing the property, which has been very difficult. The house was in really bad shape on the inside. But we put a lot of restrictions on the house to retain its authenticity to the outside. So it was restored back to about 1915. The bay window was added on by the White family in 1915. Where do you take a house back to? What are its origins? Who knows? You know, that's a guessing game. But we liked the way it looked in the neighborhood, and we made it our mission to make sure that the new owner, who's done an excellent job restoring this, to take it back to the way it was. And so he's almost done. And this house is going to be on our house tour on Saturday, June 4th. I hope he finishes in time. George White's greatest legacy is public access to Southampton's beaches and its many waterways. If it wasn't for George White, we would look like Atlantic City. Very easily. And that's my talk. Thank you. I just want to say, mention Dick Hale, who also has some new information. He heard about my talk, and I'm going to let him share. Dick, do you want to come up here?
Yeah, so then I can get you on.
Here, I'll take him.
Tom? Yeah.
I made an innocent call to Tom last weekend when I heard about this, and I said that, have you ever heard of Randall McDonald?
I said, Ronald McDonald?
No, Randall. He was a whaler, an adventurer. He was born in 1824. That's just 100 years before I was. But he sailed on whaling ships out of Sag Harbor, although he was born out on the west coast near the Columbia River Basin. If you're familiar with the Northwest, there was not a division between Canada and the United States at that time. But he was half Chinook Indian and half Scottish. His father was descended from the noblemen of Scotland, and he was descended, his mother descended from one of the chief of the Chinook Indian tribe. But he sailed out of Sag Harbor on a ship called the Plymouth. He was in Japan for about, I don't know, 6 or 8 years. I've been reading his book, but I haven't yet completed it. But maybe Tom will make a lecture on this next year.
Thank you.
This is a great book, and is it from the Rogers Memorial Library?
No.
Did you check this out? Or no, this is purchased.
No,
Well, we should have this. It's a great book, and it also mentions the ship Manhattan, the one that Pyrrhus Concer was on. So was there a native, was he the first Native American to go to Japan? Read the book.
he might have been in Japan when Pyrrhus Concer arrived.
Oh, you think it was there already? The title of the book is Native American in the Land of the Shogun, Ranald MacDonald, and the Opening of Japan. So this is by Frederick Schott, something like that. Thank you, Dick.
Well, what he did, he got on a whaler ship out of Sag Harbor, and he had a contract that when they got the amount of oil that they required to essentially complete the trip, he could be dropped off wherever he wanted to be. So he was dropped off the coast of Japan, the island of Hokkaido, and they gave him, because he had contracted, a small boat with a sail, and he had almost a library of books. He was quite a literary person. He landed in Japan at a time when Japan was closed to outsiders. They only had any international relationships with anybody but China and Holland. But he was imprisoned when he went ashore. He stayed in prison in various places. He became an interpreter. He was interviewed in his later years by the widow of General Custer. You remember that? He lost out to the Indians, but when he was 60, he was interviewed by the widow. And this is a kind of a historical book. It's a little hard to tie it down. It rambles quite a bit. But I think you'll enjoy it. Maybe Tom will talk about it next year.
To be continued. Thank you very much. Penny's going to get mad at me if I go for an hour. Thank you very much. Any questions, comments?
Oh, I was just gonna, when you showed that picture of the chamber of the Southampton Coal and Produce, I think that was there on Main Street when I was growing up. And didn't Paul Fordham work there?
Yeah.
So that must have been the relation. I mean, right, he was descended from Mr. White. I mean,
Seymour White. He was George White's grandson. And also, if you've been to a meeting at the village hall, in the meeting room, you'll see an index of offices that are upstairs, you'll see Southampton Coal and Feed. George White had an office at the village offices.
Right, so the relationship between White and Fordham was what?
George White's married Fordham.
Fordham,
Yeah.
okay. I remember Charlotte Rogers talking about her family having White's Pharmacy on Job's Lane, right, at the court down there, or somewhere around the movie theater or Job's
Yeah.
Lane or something.
Oh, there was a Fordham Pharmacy.
That's
It's
it.
right on the corner.
Right,
Oh,
Fordham.
where that big horrible white building is. It's right
Yeah,
on that
right.
corner.
So that was her family's pharmacy.
Penny, the Sag Harbor Whaling Museum, it cost to build that enormous building at that time, $7,000.
It's a big deal. Yeah, very monumental building.
There were some questions.
Was there another story about why they allowed Manhattan to enter the port of Japan?
Well,
Had
again,
something to do with-
Penny only gives me an hour, so that,
Tom, that's
But is
not.
there another story?
no, that's a
For
great
other
story.
people, but not for, no.
Captain Mercator Cooper picked up, he was 100 miles from Tokyo, he picked up a couple Japanese sailors who were stranded. I think he picked them up twice, two different groups of stranded men, brought them back, and you know, that was amazing to the Japanese that they would do that. That was his entree. Yeah.
Tom, you have really uncovered a lot of interesting things. I mean, I'm sure some of us knew some of this, but certainly it seems like a lot of it you have really uncovered, and I think this has been one of the most interesting talks that I've ever heard about Southampton.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. And any more questions?